Welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Cord. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Pacific University MFA in Writing program, and we are so excited to welcome all of you to this event, the Mapmakers Alumni Institute. The Mapmakers Alumni Institute is programming that we run in order to support our alumni who come through the program, having won the Kwame Dawes Mapmaker Scholarship coming in. And our host tonight, Angela Wang, is among those who has won that award and is a recent graduate of our program. I'm going to start our session just by putting in the chat for everyone the program for the evening. This gives a basic description of what we're doing here tonight, what Angela's brought us here to do. And it also has links to all of the other Mapmakers Alumni Institutes that we've hosted in the past. And so if you enjoy this event, and you'd like to go back and check out all the rest that we've done over the past several years, hosted all again by Mapmakers alumni, I hope you will. Tonight's event, as you know, is called The Human in Humor. And Angela Wang, as I say, is a graduate of this program just from January. I'll do a few brief introductions of Angela, and then I will turn the floor over to her. This is her event, and she will both open and close. So I'll only be here with you for a moment, and then I get to enjoy just the way that the rest of you do. But Angela is a graduate of our program, as I say, and was a recipient, as I say, of the Kwame Dawes Mapmaker Scholarship. Her thesis was titled The Graveyard Tours, which included the critical essay titled A Death in the Family, which takes as its subject the work of both David Sedaris and our guest, Bernard Cooper. Here's how Angela concludes her essay. A specific attention and amplification to humorous approaches to our writing helps to both engage and amuse our readers while addressing heavy topics. As writers, we might do well to try to unlock and engage the underutilized lens of humor more often. And we should certainly give literary humor the respect and credit it deserves. Angela lives with her family in Seattle. Before I go, turning this over to Angela, I just want to thank both Sanjiv Bhattacharya, my friend, excellent writer, compatriot, and our other guest, Bernard Cooper, whom I just mentioned here as the subject of Angela's essay. Thank you both so much for committing this time and energy, your good humor and good faith in this room with us tonight. I'm grateful that you could join us, and I will leave it now in Angela's capable hands. So I can't wait to see what comes.
Thanks, Scott. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Fall 2023 Mapmakers Alumni Institute. My name is Angela, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our session tonight, where we will be discussing the human in humor and how all of us might consider using humor as a craft tool in our writing. And I'll start off the evening with some introductions, and we'll have Sanjiv and Bernard read from their work before we dive into our discussion. And at the conclusion of the discussion, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A from you, the audience. And if you go down, you will see this Q&A tab that you can just type in your questions. So take notes, and if you've got a question, just type it in there, and it'll pop up, and we can address you at the conclusion of our discussion. But before I formally introduce Sanjiv and Bernard, I'd like to provide a bit of background on our conversation tonight. And I had the pleasure of working with Sanjiv in my MFA program at Pacific. And in addition to teaching me how to write scenes and stories, Sanjiv encouraged me to think about humor as a craft tool. And he also introduced me to Bernard's writing, where I found his memoir, The Bill for My Father. And in Pacific MFA, the Pacific MFA program, we're required to write a critical essay, where my essay focused on how Bernard was able to weave such heart and humor to approach difficult themes of mortality, death, and how he harnessed this humor in scene and dialogue to show us the complexities and nuances of expectation within a family in his memoir. So imagine my delight when I learned that both Sanjiv and Bernard agreed to join me in this Mapmakers discussion on humor as craft, because it's basically like having your critical essay spring to life with the help of two expert practitioners. So I'd like to introduce Sanjiv Bhattacharya, who is a writer and a teacher based in Los Angeles. Originally from London, he moved to LA 20 years ago, where he has written for Esquire and GQ in the UK, as well as The Observer, The Telegraph, and others. He is the author of the book Secrets and Wives, The Hidden World of Mormon Polygamy, and his work also includes profiles, essays, and long-form reporting. And he teaches nonfiction at the Pacific University MFA program. Bernard Cooper's most recent book is My Avant-Garde Education. He's also the author of The Bill from My Father, Maps to Anywhere, A Year of Rhymes, Truth Serum, and a collection of short stories, Guess Again. Cooper is the recipient of the 1991 PEN USA Ernest Hemingway Award, a 1995 O. Henry Prize, a 1999 Guggenheim Grant, and a 2004 National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship in Literature. His work has appeared in several anthologies, including The Best American Essays of 1988, 95, 97, 2002, and 2008. His work has also appeared in magazines and literary reviews, including Harper's Magazine, the Paris Review, Story, the Los Angeles Times Magazine, Granta, and the New York Times Magazine. And he has contributed to National Public Radio's This American Life for 6 years. And for 6 years wrote monthly features as the art critic for the Los Angeles Magazine. So please welcome Sanjiv and Bernard tonight. So if we could start off with Sanjiv doing a reading, and maybe you could set up the scene, and then we can hand it off to Bernard, and then we'll dive into our discussion. Sound good?
Sure. Yeah. Do you want me to read both of the sections that we talked about?
Yeah, I think read both the sections. I think
run them. Do all the readings now, right?
Yeah, let's do it at the beginning, because I think it'll help set the stage for our discussion.
Okay. Yeah. No worries. So this is from a memoir in progress about me going to Los Angeles to work with a college friend called Akbar, who is setting up a record label over there. And I go over to and I have various adventures with him in Los Angeles, and obviously things start going wrong because it's a story. And in this particular scene, I'm coming back to get my visa sorted out. I need a visa, otherwise I can't stay in LA. So I've come back and I'm at home with my parents. All right, so this is the first section. It's my dad talking. So Shonju, Dad said at last, what is your program? He was dressed for work, everything but his hush puppies. It was his last year as an engineer before retirement. I'm mostly seeing editors picking up reference letters, I said. It was true. Some had FedExed the letters to LA, but others said, just pop in when you're next in town. So I'd scheduled a whole day of visits. Oh, for visa, Mum said. She'd taken the day off and was still in her nightdress. She looked amused. Oh, genius visa apply koriche. He's applied for a genius visa. No, you're good at studies, but not like Aninda. Aninda is genius. Aninda was another Bengali boy my age. Our parents compared us incessantly. Genius visa, Dad chuckled, but he kept his next thought to himself. Are you coming for dinner? Mum asked. I didn't make anything because I don't know. You never tell me anything. But I can go to Tesco. It depends, I said. I have to meet Akbar first. Oh, Akbar is here, she exclaimed, as though he was about to walk through the door. Yeah, we're meeting investors, I lied. He's staying at the Sanderson. Anderson Consulting, Dad said. No, the Sanderson, I said. It's a hotel. Hotel, Mum pounced. You don't know these things. When do you go to hotel? She shot me a glance. Another point scored. We might have dinner there, actually, I said. It's a dinner meeting? Mum asked. Sometimes people have dinner meetings. I don't know, we need to confirm. And then for some reason I added, we're looking to merge with a major label, actually. Oh, major label, Dad said, as though he understood perfectly. Good, Mum chopped the air. Better to be with established people. See how Akbar is doing things? He knows, he's very clever. I might be writing his dad's autobiography too, I said. Why did I offer these details? It wasn't to impress them, but to prove them wrong somehow. But it wasn't working. It never did. Oh, he is the one friends with Thatcher, isn't it? Mum said, excited now. Margaret Thatcher? Dad was a picture of skepticism. Yes, he's a big-time businessman, I said. What did Dad know about it? He's basically a tycoon. Oof, ki borataikun, Mum said, really stretching the last syllable. You should tell him if he wants a secretary, then I will work for him too. You, I said, and Dad scoffed quietly. Yeah, why not? Mum shot back at us both. I'll do a good job. I worked at British Gas 20 years. I know how to do filing and answering calls. I will make sure everything is organized. She imagined it, and it made her smile. It'll be so interesting, to see how these kind of people do things. Where is his office? Park Lane, you said? Must be very plush. Dad stood up with his bowl and said, okay, apply for job. His way of gently mocking her without descending into full conflict. It was still early. He walked out, leaving us on the sofa. And when he was safely in the kitchen with the tap running, Mum whispered to me, jealous, so jealous. And then with her teeth gritted, at least I will see a man who really did something, not just sit on the sofa watching TV like that. She made a face. Mom, she laughed. Okay, I know. But just ask him, Akbar's dad. You never know. Okay. So after this, I go off and I've got all these meetings scheduled with editors. I go off and I go and get all my reference letters for this visa. And then after that, I go to meet Akbar. He's having some sort of meeting, drinks thing somewhere. I go and meet him and he wants to get high. Drugs are a part of this story. He wants to do some coke. Now, I can't get coke at this time. I haven't got the connections at short notice, basically. There's only one person I know, drugs-wise, and he's a crack dealer who lives in the neighborhood close to where I used to live before I moved to LA. I'd done a story about the prostitutes in that area, and I was over at his place a lot. It's full of prostitutes doing drugs, basically, and I spent a lot of time there doing this story. So I knew him, and we ended up going there, smoking crack. It was a pretty gnarly scene, and then suddenly, after this night, Akbar gets up, he gets a phone call, and he just walks right out the door, and I go out after him. And so this is the scene that follows. Hold on, it's way down the end. Okay. The air outside was cool and wet, a relief after Paul's apartment, just to breathe again. I found Akbar down the street by the tower apartments with the smashed windows. He had all the body language of a man pleading with a woman. It must have been nearly 2 a.m. I swear she's telepathic, he said when he hung up. She knew I was getting fucked up. What, smoking crack? No, just whatever, up to no good, he laughed. Fuck, that place is serious, you weren't kidding. His grinding jaw and darting eyes. We were just tilting on the curb, not sure what to do next. There, but for the grace of God, he said. That could be either one of us. No, not me, fuck that. And not you either. Come on. He stared up at the spitting sky, a moment of melodrama. Yeah, but I understand that level. And so do you. You wrote a whole story. I'd had enough. Let's get a cab. We walked to Whitechapel High Street. And again, Akbar was talking about dissolving and moving between worlds, but he was wrong. Paul and Jane were broken in ways that we just weren't. They were never getting out. They were dying. You only had to look at them. And Akbar and I were just tourists, not even in it for the high, really, or the annihilation, but just to taste extremity, all the bitter flavors of life, to prove to ourselves that we too knew pain and torment, as though it was some kind of badge. But we didn't. Not like this. I was fine. I'd been in a sorry state when I was last at Paul's, but not anymore. And Akbar had been so passed over by misfortune that he couldn't stand it. Even this he must possess. But for the grace of God was just rich boy edginess. Anyone could see that God had graced Akbar in so many ways already. A cab appeared and Akbar lurched out into the street, causing traffic to slow and honk. Yo, come back to the Sanderson, he said, opening the door. It's on the way for you. And I would have, but then it hit me. Shit, my bag. I'd left it at Paul's, all those reference letters. Oh yeah, you need to go back, player. All right, listen. But the panic had set in. I got to go, Ak. Yeah, totally, I feel you. Just call me in the morning, yeah? And I took off, waving my hands in the air above me as a parting goodbye. He yelled, "See you on the other side of the world." But already I was racing like a fugitive, back down Fieldgate Street, past the Tower apartments, the smashed windows, the awning, all these places I thought I'd left behind long ago. I felt sick at what I'd done. Everything that I jeopardized, like a fool, an idiot, a crack den of all places. Any junkie would snatch that bag, hoping for a laptop, and then find my letters, my future, my entire future in that bag. Perhaps they'd discarded them already on the street and I'd find them strewn in this fetid alley somewhere. Then what? I could never go back and ask those editors again. Maybe this was it. I wouldn't get my visa now. Maybe it was all over. That's how stupid I'd been, so fucking stupid. If it wouldn't have slowed me down, I would have been punching myself in the face. I jabbed at Paul's buzzer, no answer, so I called him on the phone. Of course, his phone. Why didn't I call him the instant I realized? Does my stupidity never end? Finally, Paul came to the door. "Oh, look who's back." He was angry. "That was very rude, you know, how you and Akbar just ran out of here. You called me at the last minute, and I said, very generously, I ran past him into the living room, where everything was just as before. Jane was staring dead-eyed at the television, and her friend slumped into an armchair. But there, sweet relief, on the floor sprinkled with ash, was my bag. "And you come back, ringing the buzzer." Paul was going on behind me like an old woman, but I could barely hear him over my wheezing breath. Crack and sprinting, not the best combination. My life could resume now. I could go back to LA, and by the gods, I swore that I would never come back here again, never be so reckless, so dumb. Soon I would be in a taxi with the window down, willing the cold wind to cleanse me of the guilt and scolding and wash this moment into the past forever. But for now, just to make sure, I checked the bag, and there they were. 6 reference letters, each one filed carefully in a loose green folder marked Genius.
Wow.
No.
That is so great.
Bernard?
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to say, Sanjiv, it was so fantastic to hear you read for so many reasons. One of which is that having read your work and now hearing you read it, there's such there's this kind of airtight connection between the voice on the page and the voice with which you just read that. So that's amazing. And also, it's great to be reacquainted with a voice that you remember with, interest and affection. And it was great to hear that again. Anyway, all right, so I'm going to read from The Bill from My Father. And this is a scene toward the end of the book. My father began to experience some symptoms of geriatric dementia. And he'd always been an eccentric. So it was sort of hard to tell where his eccentricities left off and dementia began. And so I took him to an appointment to get tested, get a cognitive test. The last place my 83-year-old father wanted to be was sitting beside me in the Oxnard Hospital with a geriatric specialist. "I'm going to ask you several questions," said Dr. Montrose, "and I'd like you to answer them one at a time." My father said, "How else would I?" "How else would you what?" asked Dr. Montrose. "Answer them, for Christ's sake." "Calm down, Dad." "I'll calm down when I'm good and ready," he said. "We'll be working from what's called the mini mental state examination," said Dr. Montrose, "and I'll score your answers as we go along." Dad adjusted his hearing aid. "So test me already." The doctor retrieved a sheet of paper from her desk drawer and began to read aloud. First, she asked my father to tell her the date. I silently answered along, dismayed that he got it right and I was off by a couple of days. Was my lapse symptomatic of a larger cognitive problem? I scooted my chair closer. Now I had to prove to myself that there was nothing wrong with me by answering every subsequent question correctly. I also had to face the fact that I felt competitive with my father, as though we were opponents on a quiz show hosted by Dr. Montrose. She held the sheet of questions. Oh, sorry, I'm going to skip this part. What country are we in? State, city, hospital, floor? Not until Dr. Montrose whispered, Bernard, did I realize I'd been muttering answers under my breath. There was no way my father could have heard me from where he was sitting, so it wasn't as if I was prompting him. And anyway, I got them right. Dad, on the other hand, didn't know what floor we were on. But if he had been the one to push the elevator button instead of me, he probably would have known it was the third. The mechanics of recall are delicate, so iffy and contingent. As for calling the hospital St. Sinai, if Dr. Montrose had thought about it for a minute, she would have realized that his answer combined the names of two major medical facilities, St. Joseph's and Cedars-Sinai. His guess was as logical as it was wrong. But since the testee wasn't given credit for near misses or whimsical hybrids, why explain his errors, fine points? Besides, I'd already been caught talking to myself, and Dr. Montrose must not have thought me the most reliable advocate for a man who's rapidly failing his mini-mental. Sensing he made a mistake, my father lowered his head, laced his fingers together in his lap, and stared at one hand meshing with the other. He had the shamed inward look of a man who knows he's blundered, but doesn't know how, and therefore can't correct himself or offer an explanation. Mr. Cooper, asked Dr. Montrose, are you ready to continue? Still staring into his lap, my father nodded. His head seemed heavy, as if with answers that would soon elude him. Spell world backwards, said Dr. Montrose. Dad looked up and unclasped his hands. His glasses slid down the bridge of his nose. Why? He asked, peering over the rims. Why world? Because the world is backwards, I said to myself. Laws are repealed, iron rusts, logic unravels. Dr. Montrose said, I suggest you don't overthink the questions, Mr. Cooper. Just try to relax and let the answers come. My father poked his glasses back into place. He deliberated on every letter. D, L, O, R, W? Next, she held up a pen. Can you tell me what this is? She asked. A ballpoint, he said. Does it have your motto on it? Dr. Montrose informed him that men and women in her profession didn't, as a rule, have mottos. Then she noticed that there were, in fact, words printed on the side of the pen. She held it horizontally and squinted. Hot Water Management Service, she read. Where could this have come from? I suspected this question wasn't part of the test, but it was hard to tell where the test left off and idle curiosity began. Dad said, pens are everywhere these days. People need pens to make lists, what with all the rushing and the doing and the coming and the going. What I'd like to know, though, is what the hell is a hot water management service? He posed a blunt yet provocative question, one resistant to statistical norms, to pre- and postmodern theory. Was the need to manage hot water greater than the need to manage cold or lukewarm water? Was it managed through a system of pipes and valves? Was the service a private enterprise or government run. We hadn't a single answer among us, not a guess or speculation. The doctor continued to gaze at the pen, slowly turning it between her fingers as though she might find still other phrases inscribed on its side. Beyond the hospital window, the sky above Oxnard deepened into dusk. A couple of pink clouds glided across the horizon, and for a moment it seemed as if the building was revolving while the clouds stood still. As we tried to unpuzzle the message on the pen, the office's walls and furniture dimmed, our faces growing vague. A clock ticked loudly on the doctor's desk, and I felt in my bones that the three of us, second by second, were drawn toward a vast and eventual forgetting. Nothing we could do or say would stop it. No matter where we turned, we couldn't turn back. One day, this room wouldn't ring a bell for anyone presently sitting within it. So that is that excerpt. Thanks.
So good.
Oh, good.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, maybe if you guys could think about when you were writing these scenes, the deeper themes and the deeper, I guess, the difficult topics to talk about, like mortality, expectation, family. But the way that you guys both, wrote these scenes, they're really funny. So, I mean, there is an element of humor, but you're using humor kind of as a springboard to kind of access these more existential, darker thoughts. So maybe, Bernard, do you want to talk about that scene and kind of?
Sure. First of all, almost every scene I've written has required many rewrites.
Sure.
Just to get that down, because I think rewriting cannot be underestimated as a craft tool. And I think in the process of rewriting a scene, you probe what's going on and you probe the people involved. And if you are paying enough attention, you begin to see ways in which responses are funny, or the way that you can time them in dialogue is humorous. What happened is that I was writing about the doctor holding up a pen, and I started to feel something much darker kind of underneath the surface. Of course, the scene was about my father's cognition and whether he was going to be able to function on his own. And I would describe the scene with everyone sort of getting lost in what the pen said as being a kind of slippage where you almost forget why you're there, or Dr. Montrose sort of let down her guard. And I think it was the humor that builds up to that moment, I realized in the process of writing, allowed me to talk about what is essentially a terrifying thing, which is oblivion. This idea that all will be forgotten, that all is fleeting. And it's such a kind of difficult and unbearable idea, an idea that most people have to reckon with at some point in their lives. And sometimes I think the humor allows me to go deeper than I might have expected. And it also makes certain recognitions less terrifying, so I can draw on them as material. So that's one more thing I would like to say, which is that this came much later in the book, and I myself was experiencing, what I thought were the beginnings of a sense of aging. And I'd written so many drafts, so many rewrites, that sometimes I'd get lost in my computer trying to find different versions of things. And I would think, oh my God, I'm going to end up with dementia after writing this book. And I say that jokingly, but it started to sort of unnerve me. And that was the point in the book where I could write about confusion in a way that I felt a sort of deep identification with.
Wow. Excellent, Bernard. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know, like Sanjiv, do you in nonfiction and in memoir, like, I mean, do you think that humor is often underutilized? I mean, Bernard is talking about like accessing really deep existential questions, or or do you think it can be a latent superpower that we can all harness? Or is it something to connect with our readers? Because I know that the title of your chapter that you read from is called Genius. And I think the ending was especially poignant because it was very funny, because you're kind of making fun of yourself a little bit. I mean, you are making fun of yourself in the chapter, right? But I mean, do you find it to be true that like that humor can kind of access these deep, dark kind of existential thoughts, but also can we all do it? Do you think? What do you think?
For sure. Absolutely. I think it's one of those, I think it is kind of underutilized, because I think there's a little bit of a stigma around funny, in that serious and funny aren't always seen as compatible. Like, if you're cracking jokes, then you're kind of not serious. You're not taking it seriously. But like Bernard's reading is a perfect example of something that is very grave and very serious, but that there is lightness and there's absurdity taking place right in the middle of it, where the questions that come to mind about like hot water management versus lukewarm water management is brilliant, because that's and the way that it goes from that into that great noticing of the clouds in Oxnard, and the thought that maybe the clouds were still and the world was spinning, is I think if you can go from that kind of absurdity, which is a sort of a kind of perspective, to seeing yourself from a distance, which is what that kind of clouds moment seemed to me to be, then that's an opportunity. You're more likely to find opportunities for humor there, because, or for the opportunity to kind of see the levity in a serious moment, because it's all just about perspective. I think if you can just pan out from your predicament that you're writing about, however serious it is, and mine is a lot less serious than Bernard's in his reading, then you start to see yourself and the situation with as being maybe, not quite how it felt at the time. And I think that's, you see yourself as a bit smaller, and you have a slightly more universal scale. And I think that very often, one of the things that I've learned from Pacific and from Bernard is that when you write memoir, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sense of your old life. And that itself is a kind of a distant perspective. And I think a lot of comedy comes out of that distance between what's going on at the time and what you think is going on. And that gap, I'm probably making a few too many points here, but maybe we can unpack them.
Yeah.
That gap, I think, there's a lot of comedy comes out of that. But that's also what memoir is. I'm looking back at my life in the 90s and early 2000s at a time when I didn't really know what was going on. And I see myself now as this sort of comic figure who thinks something is happening, but I can see now with hindsight that something else is happening. And that distance allows me to kind of make sense of my situation then. And you can see yourself as kind of a little bit ridiculous and a little bit, like a bumbling comic character. Whereas at the time, I didn't feel that way. I was quite destroyed by the idea that I'd left my future at a crack then. Even though, the irony is glaring. I wasn't laughing about it in the taxi. I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm a fool. But give it a bit of time and a bit of distance, and then it starts to be funny.
You know, if I can pick up on a couple of things that Sanjiv mentioned, Angela, there is a funny way in which there may be a kind of bias, a literary bias, that if something is funny, it's not serious, and the opposite. If it's serious, it can't be funny. And I mean, I'm ultimately going to chalk what I'm about to say up to just the temperament I was born with. But I think the exact opposite. I think that the tragic and the comic are two sides of the same coin, and that you can weigh a text more one way or another. And you have to be careful about the transitions from humor to the humorous to the tragic and vice versa, because you don't want them to be abrupt and jarring. But I feel that, you know, crying and laughing are come out of sort of extremities of experience. And I also think, you know, Sanjiv used the word absurd. And I think that it may be a mistake to try to write funny, but it is absolutely necessary, I think, for every artist to observe the many, many ways in which things happen that are preposterous and absurd and make no sense and have this, you know, sort of throw you off kilter. And so I think that, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think that the humor in my work comes from an essential belief that life is filled with strange, inexplicable, surreal, absurd circumstances. And I've always been aware of them. And I've always made a point as a writer and to some extent as a visual artist, looking for those.
I think there was there's a saying, I don't know if it's in show business, but I think maybe it was a comic. I think it was the guy who started the Tonight Show. I forgot his name, but he had the formula that said that tragedy plus time is equal to comedy.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that, because it talks about the perspective and the passage of time, and like what you're saying, in the moment, it's not funny, it's tragedy, like, you know, but from the perspective you're writing, you know, in the future, you know what happened, and you look at your character, like, you're a fool. And you can either react by crying or by laughing. And I think what you said, Bernard, about tragedy and comedy being two sides of the same coin. I mean, like in drama, they either have the laughing mask and the crying mask. Why? It's like the same thing, right? Or it can be two sides of the same thing. And I think that's ultimately a human experience, right? It's part of our humanity.
You know, I also think that, again, writers discover all kinds of tones and intentions while they're writing and as they're editing. And I think the key is not to try to be tragic or try to be, you know, funny, but to just try to pay as close attention as possible to where something is taking place, who the players are, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and listen to the writing. I mean, writing, oddly, is not just a matter of giving your own voice to something, but also listening to what you're getting down on paper. Joan Didion often talked about how the writing tells you what direction it goes in. You don't always predetermine that, you know?
Yeah.
There's a sense of jokes kind of appearing as opportunities, and that if you see them, then grab them. But I think to sit and try to kind of force out like a funny scene or to make something funny is probably not the way it's going to work. I think George Saunders says it's like catching a frisbee. If there's an opportunity for a joke, then catch the frisbee. Great. And I don't know that it always has to be. The thing about tragedy is always, I think, I think if you can laugh in the face of tragedy, then fantastic. The laugh will probably be deeper, and the sense of tragedy will probably be, because of the contrast between the laugh and the situation, you'll hit both notes a bit harder. But you know, it doesn't always have to be tragic. It can just be something that just went wrong, you know. I don't think it would be a tragedy if some crackhead did steal all my reference letters. That would be, you know, you had it coming. Don't worry, you know, there are other tragedies in life. So it's just something that went wrong, that I paid a price for. You know, it could be just a poor choice of friend, poor choice of job, poor choice of entree, you know, anything that went wrong, a misfortune, you can see the lighter side of it.
I would go so far as to say, as the dialogue that Sanjiv just read, I mean, I don't want this to turn into a mutual admiration society, but the dialogue between his parents that Sanjiv just read, one of the reasons it's funny, or humorous, if not laugh out loud funny, is that both the parents and the son all have secret agendas. Like the mother kind of wants to hush the father and, kind of imply that he doesn't really know what he's talking about, and vice versa. And the son is sort of put in this place between the parents of mediating or keeping the peace. And I think sometimes the humor arises out of a schism between what people say and what the writer or the reader knows is going on under the surface. And that's also what makes dialogue electric as opposed to just flat.
Right, because there's a subtext, right? It's what people say and what people mean,
and what they don't say.
Exactly, and what they don't say, what's going on, and what they would like to pretend is going on. It's that gap. That's where all the fun is. And I think there's an aspect to this as well, that if you can introduce a laugh, if you can, I think you're doing God's work anyway. If you can raise a smile, life is hard enough, right? But especially when you're telling a grim story about, mortality or something like that. But what you're communicating as well to the reader is that you haven't been defeated by whatever's happened. There's a sense of, if you're enjoying telling the story to a reader, then that enjoyment is contagious, and that whatever terrible experience you went through, it hasn't broken you, because you're able to see the funny side as you're telling the story. I think the last thing that you want is to hear a sob story. You're going to tune in to not necessarily a joke, but just somebody who can see it from that kind of remove, from that perspective, and can see the lightness and the absurdity of a grim situation. And that sort of lets the reader know that it's okay. I'm okay. I haven't got my head in my hands as I type.
This might be a bit of a leap, but another thing this brings to mind is that I hope in what I read, and I know in what Sanjiv read, that people's absurdity is coming out, including the absurdity of the writers. But it's without condescension. Nobody's being made fun of. What's funny is that they're an embodiment of the odd, fragile creatures that people are. And so a lot of times when jokes are at the expense of a character in fiction or someone being remembered in nonfiction, it doesn't work. It seems condescending and judgmental. Whereas if you're aimed at the basic fallibility that we all feel being human, and a recognition that sometimes we're ridiculous, all of us are totally ridiculous, then it sort of sidesteps condescension, putting people down or making them appear stupid.
I think that's a really key point, is that in both of your readings, the narrator is almost making fun of themselves and the absurdity of within themselves, like in the moment, and also what they're thinking. And it's not at the expense of any of the characters. So it's not mean-spirited, it's not satire, right? Is a difference. So I think that's really important in this discussion about what we're trying to accomplish in our writing. And that's a great point, Bernard. I think and also I think people in general, maybe in the literary community, they have a bias against funny things or humorous things because they think it might be an avoidance of difficult topics or an avoidance of. I mean, there's a question I see in the chat that it's a shield or someone who's not willing to kind of make a joke about it and laugh and move on. But I think in both of your readings, I think that all of us have seen the deeper themes like familial expectations and mortality, death, like oblivion. These are not like trite things. So I think, but you both harness humor in both of those, pieces in a way that doesn't make it like trite or avoid it. You're actually kind of confronting it head on.
Yeah,
So,
and I also think that an attentive reader knows when a writer is being funny to push away what's really important.
Mhm.
And that usually does not fly or it doesn't work. But there's a way to use humor not as a shield, but pardon my extended metaphor, as a kind of net that actually can bring things closer rather than push them farther away.
yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
What,
Can I just jump in on a point that you made earlier, Angela, about like making fun of yourself, being self-effacing, and seeing yourself as a kind of a ridiculous figure or as a comical figure in some way, rather than kind of poking fun at somebody else in a way that doesn't work. It's kind of a cliche that writing things down is therapeutic when you're writing about like something that went wrong, something that was difficult to talk about, and that there is a therapeutic value of getting it down and expressing, the bad thing. But I'm no psychiatrist, but I think it's actually quite psychologically healthy to see yourself as a bit of an absurd figure and to not take yourself quite so seriously, because I think a lot of the heaviness of life comes from exactly that, from feeling that, you've been through a terrible experience and it's weighing you down. I think what you can do is just, if you see yourself as a bit more of a comic character, then I don't know, it all becomes a bit more bearable.
You were talking earlier, Sanjiv, about, being able to kind of pull back and see yourself from a bit of a distance. And, I wouldn't say it was therapeutic, but I think there's something incredible about being able to talk clearly about something that's chaotic or complex. And the act of sort of separating yourself from things that are painful in order to write about them for me, I think it makes those painful things bearable. And clearly, if given a choice, I would rather that life be bearable rather than unbearable. So, there's something about a distance, acquiring a certain distance that allows you to see a little more clearly than when you're in the middle of something, when you're in the heat of the moment. And that's one of the great luxuries, not just of writing, but again, of editing, is that you get to work with the material.
So Bernard, I think it leads to another question that I have, was writing the humor into your work hard, or was it kind of simply an extension of your personal voice or perspective in showing and telling the reader? And did these funny aspects come in later revisions, or did you kind of capture the scene and be like, oh, I want to talk about this particular incident? Or did it come through after like many, many revisions?
Well, I guess I would say that anything that's good about my work that is either tragic or comic comes after the 2000 revisions. It's like that's where you can really discover what it is you mean, what it is you mean to say. And I don't feel that I write humor into my work. I feel that I write something and then listen to it. And if there's humor there, I take that out of the work and use it, or out of the situation and use it. And, I think that I have always had this feeling that joy and suffering and tragedy and comedy are two sides of the same coin. It just is a kind of sensibility I was born with. I think my parents had it. I think, comedians share it. I think a recognition of human suffering seemed to me when I was growing up as sort of to have something to do with, though I wasn't brought up religiously, growing up in a Jewish household, where there's just this kind of understanding that there has been and probably will be suffering in the world, and everyone, has that burden, everyone, and has to make something, out of it for themselves.
Yeah.
Comedians are famously depressed, right? They just genuinely are. I think there's probably studies in psychology magazines about like how depressed comedians are, and I think it's true. It all comes from the same place. I think there's a coping mechanism aspect to it, to being able to laugh at misfortune, but I think you have to come out of it at the other end is the thing. I think that when you look at somebody fall over, right? This is cartoon Tom and Jerry, right? Somebody falls over. It's only funny if they get up again. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
And then it kind of dissolves our own fear of falling over to some degree. And we see the silliness of it. You land on your ass and your legs are waggling in the air, and it's ridiculous. And we're afraid of that happening to us. But then you get up. You can't be defeated by it. And I think there's something kind of brave about it, I think.
That's excellent. What do you, in your writing, what do you find inspiration in terms of your own reading and writing life do you seek out funny things to read? Do you find inspiration in stand-up comedy? Outside of your writing, do you find inspiration other than the absurdity of, life, but are there people or are people who you look to find kind of inspiration for that in your work?
You asking me or Bernard?
Both of you, yeah. Oh, yeah, you, Sanjiv.
Well, one of the memoirs that I quite like is by a stand-up comedian who I enjoy. He's a kind of an acquired taste. Maybe he's not everybody's cup of tea, but somebody called Doug Stanhope, and his memoir. It's a comedian's memoir. He's a stand-up. It's called Digging Up Mother, and his mother died. His mother was his inspiration. But his mother didn't just die. It was an assisted suicide, right? Talk about gallows humor and dark humor, right? It was an assisted suicide. She was dying of emphysema and she wanted to go her own way. And he was there to sort of help her along. And so she took a whole bunch of morphine pills, and she's kind of drifting, and it's taking longer than it's supposed to. And he's there with his girlfriend and various other people trying to kind of send her off in a nice way. They're all having a drink and trying to make it a kind of a positive, happy occasion. And as she's, going to the other side, they're waking her up and go, "Oh, Mom, wait, they found a cure."
Oh, no.
That's funny.
Oh, God.
And it's true. And that's somebody who loves their mother, who owes everything to their mother. So I found that kind of thing really emotional and hilarious. So that's a recommendation.
There are lots of writers I could name who I think are, really funny. probably the funniest essay I've ever read in my life is by David Foster Wallace, a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. And it is about him, being the neurotic person he is, taking a luxury cruise. And he is unable to shake the fact that when he looks out at the open ocean at night, it's one of the most terrifying existential things he's ever seen. But then he can go inside to an all-you-can-eat buffet where people are passing out from overeating, and the contradictions, that just are woven throughout it are amazing. I do pay attention to certain comics who I love, not so much because of their humor, but because comics often have to compress a story down to the absolute essentials to make it kind of ignite into something that takes an audience by surprise and makes them laugh. And so the economy of a well-told stand-up story or joke, I'm always kind of trying to read the structure that comics have used in order to make, say, half an hour's worth of material.
That's excellent. And that kind of leads me to my other kind of question, that this institute is part of the Pacific University's bridge to help connect to the larger world. And what are some specific craft techniques that we as prose writers can use to make our writing funnier? And I know we mostly, I'm talking more from a perspective of a memoir writer or someone in nonfiction, where we don't have to make things up as much as someone in fiction might have to do. So I'm wondering, what kind of techniques might you use to help others who might be listening who write fiction or who write poetry, perhaps to make their work funnier, or if that's a goal in their writing to kind of do that. But because I don't think in nonfiction we don't have to make it up. We're just trying to capture the scene. You remember the emotions, and we know what the punchline is. You don't kind of have to make it up. But I think it's a lot harder in fiction to do these things. So
I think sometimes it's a way of looking. I think that's one of the things that you can do is they talk about punching up scripts out here. Comedy writers, they talk about punching up scripts, and so you tell the story and then you insert jokes, and that's a very kind of screenwritery way of looking at it. But I think there's a sort of there's a sort of equivalent, I think, if you're in prose and you're just telling a story. You don't want to kind of gratuitously shoehorn in jokes. That's not going to work. But I'm reading this book. I've just read this book called The Reluctant Carer, about somebody who's they're a middle-aged guy whose life falls apart, divorce, he's broke, and he goes back to help his parents who are sick. And there's a scene in which he comes home one day and he finds his dad on the floor in front of the TV, kind of in a state, and his dad's not well. Now that scene could be very grim and alarming, and I'm sure it was when he came. It's oh my God, what's happened to my dad? Is that it? That was always the question. Is this the moment when his heart gives out? Is this when he dies? So it's grave and serious, but the way that he described it was, it looked like he was kind of praying to the television, in kind of on his knees in front of the television, because that's what old people do. They watch a lot of TV. And so it immediately just by looking at it in a slightly different way, it just made the whole thing a little bit more when he describes it in that way, that he's okay with it, that his dad probably didn't die in that moment. And that, so maybe that's something that you can do. Just look at the physicality of a situation. Sometimes when you get those freeze frame photos that are badly timed and people's mouths are open and whatever, and they look kind of funny. Sometimes situations can kind of, if you catch them from the right angle, can look ridiculous. And you can kind of, like when Bernard says, when you're going through a revision and you're being more forensic and careful about every single thing, you can see these opportunities if you are So sometimes the physicality, I suppose that's the point I'm trying to make. The physicality of the situation can present a chance.
Nice.
You know, listening to Sanjiv speak, you know, he might, and if any of my students are here, they might laugh that I'm about to talk about Flannery O'Connor, the writer who I mention ad nauseum. But she talked a lot about writers developing what she called the habit of being, which is to, simply put, I mean, it's certainly harder to achieve than it is to describe, but to always try to observe, as you know, what's going on around you at every moment as keenly as possible. And even overhearing conversations, or you know, sitting down in a public place and watching people. And I think that is a good way for a writer to develop their voice in general. But if they have a sense of funny take on life, to start to employ that because they're watching what's happening around them. You know, as far as strategies go, I don't know if there's anything that can help make a writer's work funnier, but I think that economy, which I was speaking about a moment ago in regard to humor, that economy is going to allow people to see with hopefully blazing clarity the people and situations that you're writing about. And I think that economy is important both to have something starkly tragic and also incredibly funny. That both those things arise out of economy, of paying attention to every word. So I think that's an important skill to develop, regardless of the tone of one's writing.
That's great, Bernard. Thank you for that. That's amazing.
Wasn't I lucky to go to Bernard's workshop?
Yeah, I know. Like, this is amazing. I'm like, right.
He just lives down the street. Great.
But maybe talk about I think we're coming on an hour, so we probably have 15 more minutes and then another 15 minutes for questions. So I think humor just might be one craft tool in helping to tell a larger and harder story. Are there other tools that you might use in terms of telling a bigger story? Like, I know that you, Sanjiv, you're not really writing memoir anymore. You're writing long form journalism and true crime now, and investigative journalism. And Bernard, you've been doing visual art, and you are still doing a lot of visual art as well. So can you talk about kind of your evolution in writing in your work now and what you guys are doing?
Well, for my part, I just kind of took a break, you know, from the memoir. I kind of do miss the opportunity to funnel sort of funny observations and sort of that kind of joy of life into work, because what I'm working on now is a murder story. It's not hilarious, and it would be inappropriate for me to kind of try and squeeze out the jokes. I think that would be disrespectful to what's happened. So I don't really get to do that right now. So I kind of miss it. But, you know, it's one of those things. That's all it is. It's not that I've kind of derailed and gone in a different direction on a permanent basis. It's just that, you know, I'm taking a break from one, but they're so different. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to go between them.
Thanks for asking about my visual art, Angela, which is pretty much what I've been devoting the lion's share of my time to for the last 6 years, after writing a book about the art school I went to. And I got so involved with that I just started to play around again with images. This probably won't make much sense without seeing the work, but I feel that what I'm doing in visual art is I am still making sentences. I am combining forms that are interlinked that create a whole. And you can't take away any one form without having the meaning of the whole thing collapse. It's abstract. It doesn't deal with meaning in the same way that language does. But I've found that, when I write, the sentence is such an extremely important unit of meaning. I mean, that sounds like an incredibly obvious thing to say, but you really want every sentence to hold the reader. It's like a huge kind of labor to make every sentence taut and meaningful. And a lot of that way of making meaning through a set of forms that add up to a meaning that's larger than the sum of its parts, it has carried through for me to making visual art. And one of the most satisfying things anyone has ever said about my visual art was I'm very close friends to an incredible poet named Amy Gersler. And I didn't show my visual art to my friends for a really long time. I made it a kind of private practice to just see where I was going. And she was the first person I said, would you look at some of these things I've been making? And she walked in to the studio and she looked around for a brief moment and she said, oh, you're still writing. And she just got exactly that sort of word by word, sentence by sentence, way that meaning accumulates and that I was employing it still. And it was just one of the most gratifying things anybody's ever said about my work.
That's great. It's like a visual representation of sentences, like visually.
Yeah.
Really cool. Yeah. Excellent. I think we have quite a few questions in the chat. You guys wanna let's answer some of them, does that sound good to you guys?
Sure.
Or do you want to say anything else? Is there anything else you want to talk about or say, or say hello to your posse here?
Definitely hello to the posse.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what questions people have.
Okay, here, there's a question here from Stephanie. It says, a chicken and egg question. Does a funny moment happen, or does the moment become funny because of the intent of the writer, especially when dealing with hard topics? So kind of, how do we know when to apply humor, right, and when if it's a rightfully so?
Don't know. There's a thing about like applying humor. Like I don't know if you always can. It's not always available. I don't think you can just make everything funny if you want to. It's not just like a filter or an option that you can just do. But I think that there are, like, I started off rambling about like the distance between what's happening and what you think is happening, or and viewing yourself from a distance, having that kind of a perspective. I think where there is that kind of gap, maybe there's an opportunity. I think it only really comes when you really start sort of looking carefully, when you slow down. With for the genius letters, for example, obviously that's a clear irony. I was aware of it at the time. I just didn't find it funny that I'd left my genius reference letters in a crack den. I thought, well, this is going to be a good story one day, but right now I'm just ashamed. But so sometimes, it's just glaring. It's just like, this presents itself as an irony, and therefore you can wring it out. Maybe that's my take on that question.
I appreciate and understand, I think, the questioner's question, but I wonder if apply is the right word, because again, I think that it's about listening to what arises organically out of the material. It's not, I mean, sometimes you can suddenly grab something funny and put it in the writing and it works. But I think it's not applied from without. It comes from within the writer's imagination and their relationship to the material that they're working on. And I think one of the things that hopefully every writer develops is, I mean, we probably all have, some relatives who make really bad jokes that are inappropriate, which are referred to, I think, understandably as groaners, where people don't laugh, but they just go, and you don't want to do that, So I think what you do is you listen to see if you've captured a joke and brought it to the surface of the prose, that you want to, again, this is editing, you want to reread it, and you want to make sure that it isn't something that will make people wince somehow, and that it is appropriate to the predominant mood of that moment in the prose. That can shift from page to page, but if you're allowing a reader to feel the joy of humor, you don't want to interrupt it with a hearse driving into the scene for no reason. And the opposite is true too, that it's about bringing out everything that can move a reader in that scene and not distracting them from some essential feeling or experience that the scene is evoking. You can do it the next page, perhaps, but
yeah, I agree entirely. Like if it takes you deeper into the scene and if it illuminates it even more, then that's the joke that you should tell. There's a famous rivalry between like the Simpsons writers and the Family Guy writers. I think it's because Family Guy came second and they think it's derivative and stuff. So it's just been a long running thing. But one of them was about the approach to jokes. And it was that Simpsons jokes came out of story, whereas Family Guy jokes were very often cutaways. It was like, oh, and that reminds me of another funny thing that happened, and it takes you out of the story to a new kind of thing that is just designed to make you laugh, and then they'll bring you straight back in again. And I think there was a time anyway when the Simpsons writers was like, well, that's just bad storytelling. We don't do jokes that way. We do jokes that kind of illuminate character, illuminate story, bring you further in. So yes, exactly what you were saying.
Like trying too hard to get a laugh. Like you're trying.
Yes. Yes, exactly. It's like wearing a red nose. It's too much.
Yeah, there's
made me laugh.
I've noticed in the chat or the Q&A, there's a couple of questions that kind of ask, do you set out with the intent to make a certain scene funny for a certain purpose, or do you find it just happens to unfold that way? And this is kind of what we've been talking about. It seems like it has to be kind of organic, and there's something there in terms of perspective or distance or absurdity that kind of comes out after revision, right? It might not necessarily be funny to start.
Well, also, I mean, in terms of at least my book, The Bill from My Father, which was trying to address, one of the, most primary difficult relationships in my life, which was with my father, which is that I set out to try to discover who he was and who I became in relation to him. And there's so much, and some of that is tragic to me, and some of it is hilarious to me. So I was trying to explore as deeply as I could who that human being was, and to exploit a whole range of feelings, which include the tragic and the humorous.
Great, yeah. And there's another question here. I've been told my humor is a shield to avoid entering or skimming the deeper emotions in my writing. How do you know, or how can you know when you are avoiding and when you are allowing? That's a good question.
That is a good question.
Maureen.
Hi, Maureen. Nice to see you.
I think that unfortunately you have to rely on yourself to figure out if you're using humor as a way to push things away. And I think writers don't often give themselves enough credit for knowing or understanding what they're trying to do. And the word glib is often used to, when you're talking about somebody deal with something difficult in a cursory, dismissive way. They're just batting it away. And, I guess writers have to ask themselves, am I doing that now? I do, again, really, I'm very dubious about the idea, though, that humor is necessarily or inherently a way of avoiding things that are difficult. I think, again, it might be a way of digging even more deeply into things that are difficult.
Right. Okay, there's a question from Roni. How do we navigate mockery versus humor as writers? Especially when I find that Asians are othered by the mocking of their accents in culture and media and in actual spaces. So I guess it kind of goes back to what we were talking about who are we making fun of, characters or people versus making fun of ourselves, I think.
Yeah, now I feel bad about doing the accent for my mom and my dad. But that's how they talk. You know what? I think that malapropisms and malaprops, people who get words wrong and pronounce things differently, sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it just leads to situations where there are misunderstandings and it's just comical. And it is a difficult line, I guess. It is a difficult line, but I think sometimes we can only be the judges of our own sort of our own sense of humor. If you find it funny, is that mockery? Are you laughing at somebody's I don't know, deficiency, or are you stereotyping? Is that really what's happening? Because if it is, then correct it. But it doesn't necessarily. It ain't necessarily so. I like to think that jokes are kind of the things that we laugh at. They're measured by whether we find them funny or not. Are you laughing? If you're laughing, then it's funny, and maybe then you need to kind of figure out what it is that's funny about it. My hope would be that for most people, cruelty isn't funny. It's just mean. Whatever it is that you're laughing at is something else, I would like to think.
And also, I think most writers, if they look at their intentions closely, know when they're trying to mock someone. And it gets back to this issue of condescension. If using somebody's voice or their diction, as a way of condescending toward them, it's awful. But there's this other thing that I think is so important, is that, the world is like a Tower of Babel, and is sometimes in a magnificent way. I mean, right now it seems like in a really annoying, terrifying way. But part of what is beautiful is that people find odd ways of expressing themselves verbally, and it's a kind of music. And if you're not letting the music of someone's speech or accent come into it, you're missing something really beautiful. I mean, my father, for example, my parents spoke Yiddish and I did not. And there's something about the way they spoke that was really, in a way I can't quite articulate because I don't speak in Yiddish, was informed by the diction and syntax of a language that meant a great deal to them. It was also kind of music to me, where, you know, my father would often answer questions with questions. And it seemed like a kind of call and response, or this sort of incredible way to use echo in a piece of writing. And it's not about mocking him, it's about finding the music in the way that he speaks. And you know, whatever our different backgrounds are, I think we have these kind of treasures of being able to use, you know, voices of, you know, ways of speaking of the people we come from, that gives something unique and musical to writing, which is not just something that happens on the page, but is informed to a large extent by sound.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. And that kind of leads well to the last question that we have here is, how do you know, from Therese, how do you know when you've lapsed into too much interior dialogue as you probe a scene to reveal the humorous insights? And it maybe goes back to what Bernard, you were talking about, economy and like containing everything.
I'm thinking that question makes me think about, you know, the time that it takes to read. Like, so like when you're in a scene and you want to make an observation, because scenes are in real time, you know, you're talking about things that are happening in real time, and the idea of a scene is that it takes as long to read it as it does for it to happen. So if you're going too far down a sidebar, because you're trying to probe some sort of joke or some moment or some reference or something, and it goes on for a bit too long, then you'll be taken out of the scene just by the fact that it's just taken a bit too long. So that's one way to think about it, to keep yourself within the reins of, like, you know, you can't go on for more than 60 words or whatever. Depends what's happening in the scene, really.
I'm kind of really going to second that. I think that, first of all, I think in a draft, you try everything. And if you want to have an interior monologue that lasts 3 pages, give it a try. And if you think I think what can happen is that it can get too cerebral, and one is pulled out of the realm of action and you know, things happening, which is a huge force that pulls people through a narrative. What happens next? And the other thing it can do that's potentially maybe not so beneficial to prose is that it can tell, by telling a reader what the writer was thinking, after a certain point can rob the reader of coming to their own conclusion of what people were thinking by seeing their actions or hearing their tones of voice or being shown their gestures, which, you know, really change what it is that we say, the meaning of what we're saying. So you know, and I think all writing is it's like walking a tightrope. I mean, you just hope you can stay up on that thing and that you don't fall into something too cerebral, or just like something that's all action and no thought, or something that's all interior and has no sort of tangible sense of a life lived about it, but you know, it is all in one's head. And I think it's, you know, one learns after much writing and much editing a relative sense of balance. And the other thing that I think is really an important answer to these questions is find a few people who will read your work. A few people who will say, wow, the page 6 was really boring. Could you pull back on all that? And considering where people are flagging or not following through, what's happening on the page.
That's great. Yeah. Plug for writers groups, plug for finding your posse to help you with your work.
Even if it's 1 or 2 people, that's enough. It's a kind of safety net that because there are so many words a writer has to be responsible for. And, I don't say this to make people fearful. In fact, the opposite, but so many things can go wrong in a piece of writing. And you just have to keep working at it until it all seems inevitable and as right as you can make it. And sometimes that involves showing it to other people.
Excellent. Yeah, cool. Well, we are almost out of time. Scott, do you want to come back on here and take us out to the sunset?
Well, let me get my light back on. That was just so wonderful to spend this time just listening in and taking this in. Angela, congratulations for putting this together. Bernard, Sanjiv, the readings were beautiful. We had a lot of fun. And then we did what we tried to do, which Angela was saying, this is what it's like to be at the Pacific program, right? We take the work seriously, we had fun with it, and then we try to understand how it works and try to, teach people how it works. And this has felt just like a really wonderful masterclass in grappling with the tension between, the 2 sides of the coin, the 2 sides of the mask. But with a real intention, it seems to, from both of you really, and Angela too, of thinking about what we do is this craft that requires not just the sort of the bursts on the page of inspiration, but Bernard, you kept going back to this idea. It gets funnier when you revise. It's revision. It's revision. It's revision. It's the work. And I want to thank you for coming and reminding us that it's just the work, and then it can be funny. So Sanjiv, Bernard, thank you for being with us tonight. Angela, I look forward to organizing the next of these with you. And congratulations for a really, really fine night. Wonderful to see all of you. Have a great night. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Awesome.
So